Hello everyone and welcome to Daily News Simplified, your one-stop solution to detailed analysis of current affairs which are published in the daily edition of the Hindu newspaper. Articles dated 21st of January 2023 are listed on your screen and the time stamping along with the notes in PDF and Word format are given in the description box. So let us begin with the first article for the day. We have an important announcement for you. As a part of Pre-Pareekshan series 2023, we are going to conduct the first test on 28th and 29th of January. This will be followed by live discussion of this test on 30th January. For this, you can opt for either online or offline mode to write the test. For this, you have to do is to register on elearn.rauias.com. This test will help you to assess the real competition of UPSC. It will allow you to get your level of preparation and will also allow you to know how much more hard work is required to clear this examination. Further details of this test are given in the description box. As a lead article for today, we have taken an article from the 14th page of the Hindu newspaper in which there was a contrasting views which were published with respect to a report under the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. And in this report, they have clearly highlighted that the sectors which are associated with the exports of productions, export of products, and including the services are going through the high level of unemployment. Now, before moving to the entire discussion, first thing first is that you should be clear about what this topic is all about. This topic is about the employment generation in the Indian economy in those areas or those sectors which are export led. For example, we have IT enabled services. For example, we have production of mobile phones or even the automobile. But if these products, these services are being provided to the Indian people inside the domestic territory of India, then that is not a part of export. But the moment we say that we are exporting the IT services, we are exporting automobile or even the mobile phones, that section of Indian economy, that production activity or service activity, when it generates the employment, it becomes important. And that is the core area of this article. And we are going to conduct a much detailed analysis of these two interrelated Indian economy topics. So from the relevance of the UPSC examination, in the mains examination GS paper 3, where 50% of the weightage is given to the economy, that is around 120 or 130 marks are allocated to the economy section. Employment is an important dimension given by the UPSC in the syllabus itself. And in the past also, as you can see, these are the two important questions. In 2017, they have asked with respect to the labor intensive exports rather than the capital intensive exports, which clearly proves that they wanted to ask a question with respect to exports and employment. In 2016, they asked a question with respect to the globalization and its impact on the employment. Globalization means taking Indian economy to the global world, opening it thoroughly and getting interaction with the global standards. Now, both these questions have dimensions which are equivalent to the exports and employment topic. So, in today's discussion, we are going to talk about basic reasons which were highlighted in this report for the rise of unemployment in the export led sectors. We are going to look into why export sector is important to generate employment in India. Plus, we will also look into some of the issues with respect to the export led employment generation. Next, we are going to look into the basic issues with respect to the export sector. This discussion is going to be very important from the means perspective. And in the last, we are going to look into many way forwards or the measures that are required in order to capture higher employment generation through the export-led industries. So let's start with what report has to say. As per the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy or CMIE, although India has now achieved a pre-pandemic level of employment. For example, before March 2020, the almost employment generation in India was 410 million, that is 41 crore people were employed. After the announcement of the lockdown and in the last 2 years, there was a very high level of unemployment that even touched double digit. But in the last 1 year, there was a slight jump in the employment generation in almost all the sectors. But despite that, according to this report, unemployment rate has increased at 10%, especially in urban areas and export-led sectors. The another observation of the report says that after the ending of pandemic and especially in the last 1 year, there was an observation with respect to the re-entry of 20 million workers, which includes women and youth to a larger extent. So these women or these youth were not there in the last 2 years, but now they have re-entered, which proves that they were already working before the pandemic, but now they have come back to the main economic activities. And most of the population of India is living in rural India. They migrated back to the rural India during the pandemic. Now they are coming back. So what we are observing? We are observing the large waves of rural to urban migration. This migration has created a burden on the industrial sector as well as the service sector, which is now finding it difficult to provide employment to the excess labor supply. In the last 3 years, economy got adjusted to the low level of employment, but this large migration has created demand and supply mismatch. No wonder why it has created a level of high unemployment. Now let's go deeper into the topic and try to discuss from the perspective of means examination. Why exports are required to generate employment? The first reason is the saturation of employment generation. Every economy, no matter whether it is a developed or developing economy, has its own limitation with respect to the generation of employment. There is a supply and demand equality. If there is not, there is unemployment situation. Indian economy is around the saturation, which is between 40 crores to 45 crores of employment in the current scenario. If economy reaches the saturation and economic activities does not provide the generation of more employment, what will happen? There will be the saturation of employment in the domestic market, and then comes the role of extra jobs being created by the export sector. Because now we are generating output for somebody who is not residing in India. When they demand more, we will produce more, we will demand more labor, and that's how employment generation will be expanded. The second one is as the global value chain is expanding year on year. India already have excess supply of labor. So why not utilize that excess supply of labor and leverage that to be part of global value chain where India can produce final goods, capital goods, and even the components of a particular product. Exports require expertise. They are multinational companies which want to utilize Indian labor to reduce the cost of production. So they will invest more. More foreign investment in the export-led sector will attract more employment generation. So it's a win-win situation for both Indian labor as well as the foreign companies. If you go by the basics of the economics, you will find that a country will export mostly that product in which it has higher inputs at lower cost. So let's take the example of US. Now in US, machines are cheaper and labor is expensive. So US will try to produce more of those products which are machine produced. India, on the other hand, have more supply of labor, less machinery. So India will produce that output or that product which has more excess utilization of labor as an input. So as India has more labor surplus, India will produce more outputs which are labor intensive. This will reduce the cost of production. So more focus on the export led on labor intensive will provide employment generation. Global economy looks for best quality standards in these goods and services, and that attracts more skill development of the employees. Now India is in the transition of skill development. More and more hundreds and thousands of youth is getting skilled every year, and that is creating employment generation on its own. India can utilize the same for the export sector. Export want good and high skilled labor. India can provide that. And the last argument is that agriculture sector where the largest section of Indian population is involved. If export is the basic aim of agriculture sector, it can help in doubling the farmer income in a very small period of time. Along with that, it will fight the disguised unemployment. Now, disguised unemployment means when the marginal productivity of labor is zero. For example, in an agriculture field, there are 5 men who are working. These 5 men are working and producing, let's say, 100 kg of wheat. When one of the member from the family, or let's say from that group, leave for, let's say, the urban center, now there are 4 people who are working on the field. But surprisingly, the output of the field remained the same, that is 100 kg. It simply means that the one person who was working on that field was producing or adding nothing extra to the overall production. So this is disguised unemployment. Now, from this discussion, it seems that exports are very beneficiary for generation of employment. But there are counter arguments also. There are various issues which are involved in going towards the export-led employment generation. The first one is that they are subjected to the demand conditions in the other economies. For example, let's say India is exporting pharmaceuticals, and tomorrow European Union says that they are no longer going to use the medicines coming from India. That will render thousands of industries in the recession. Hundreds and thousands of people will lose their job. So demand condition in other economy determines whether there will be employment generation in India or not. And this is very, very fragile state of economic condition. The second argument is that, as we have discussed previously, best quality matters in the exports of goods and services. If we try to move for the export-led employment generation, we should not compromise with the quality of output that we are providing. Now, India is not a country which provides best quality of products in all the fields. So, relying too much on the export-led employment could be dangerous because high-quality products are not there in India. Indian labor is more suitable for low mechanized production and high manual work because of this skill gap. If we force a labor to work in those industries which are export led, we will be compromising on the quality of products, and ultimately we are going to lose customers at the international market. India has a high population, that too employed in the agriculture sector. On the other hand, the agriculture sector in the global market is already being dominated by the developed nation. For example, Europe and Russia is very much famous for their wheat product. As far as corn is concerned, so US take the lead, and they are providing very heavy subsidies on these outputs of agriculture produce that they cannot compete with Indian expensive goods. Along with that, we have the MSP regime which automatically makes Indian exports very expensive. The reason of their dominance is not only the price but also the quality that they are providing. If we try to rely more on the export led, let's say government tomorrow starts exporting more wheat from India, but that wheat of India is going to compete with the wheat provided by Russia. And on the quality terms, we are going to get a negative ranking. That will hurt the employment generation itself. The last argument is that the high value exports that India has are from the capital intensive sector where the employment elasticity is already low. For example, India is one of the top exporter of machines, IT enabled services, petroleum products, jewelries, and all these sectors are very much capital intensive. And not only that, if you go by the basic standards of economic growth, all these sectors have been registering very high growth in the last 2 decades. So despite having large number of labor, Indian exports are mostly capital intensive. So how can India rely on export led employment generation? The term which we have used here is employment elasticity. Employment elasticity means how much employment has been generated because of the economic growth. Now, higher economic growth should also come with higher employment generation. But as far as capital intensive sectors are concerned, for example, IT growth and the employment generation in this sector has not been very, very promising. On the other hand, labor intensive sectors where employment elasticity is very high, 1% of growth might increase the employment generation by 1% in those areas. Now, all these arguments are very relevant for you to remember and write in the mains examination. Now, let us come to why India still have low export. This is an overall picture, the macro picture of India's export sector. There are major issues and there are certain recent issues which have been cropping up for the lower export region in India. The first is that India is exporting mostly those goods which already have cheaper alternatives. China, ASEAN nations have already replaced India in multiple sectors, especially agro goods, plastic goods, and even the small items which are used in the festivals like LED lights. So China is making inroads with these cheaper alternatives where India is already facing high competitive backwardness. Now, India has a high labor supply because of its higher demographic dividend, which is a positive sign, no doubt. But despite that, India has high capital intensive goods exports that we have already discussed previously. Another reason is that India is one of such developing country which has faced a lot of WTO restrictions on its exports, including the intellectual property rights violations, sanitary, phytosanitary norms on its exports, especially the food items. In the last 2 decades, it was observed that many economies across the world, be it the developing, be it the developed economies, have adopted the devaluation of their currency. Once a currency is devaluated, we all know by the basic economic principle, exports become profitable and imports become expensive, which improves the trade deficit. But when other countries devaluate their currency, it automatically makes Indian currency revaluate. And revaluation of Indian currency at a higher rate makes Indian currency more expensive, which ultimately hurts Indian exports. India also have high skill gap, especially with respect to demand and supply in the industrial sector, which are targeting the exports. Indian labor is already underskilled, semi-skilled when compared to the labor from China and Vietnam. In terms of MSME, there are over 63 million MSMEs in India, but despite that, their total contribution in the export is yet not close to 50%. India has already been reluctant to join new trading blocs, including the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, from which it has withdrawn its membership. India have very limited free trade agreements. For example, as of now, according to the Ministry of Commerce, there are 13 free trade agreements that India has signed till 2022. And lower number of free trade agreements means lesser flexibility in expanding the overall exports. Lower exports expansion means lower possibility to create employment. Not only that, there is a poor diversity as far as export destination is concerned. So whether you talk about top importers or top exporters, the country more or less remains the same. So top 10 countries in their composition of export destination for India has remained more or less the same in the last 1 decade. India has been very conserved when it comes to the expansion or diversify its export destination. Countries from Africa, countries from South America, and even other smaller countries of Central Asia have been less in relation to how India's export destination are going to function. Indian government schemes which were launched, for example, special economic zones, for example, Make in India, have been very limited in terms of what they were expected to produce. And lastly, there are infrastructural issues. There is a credit unavailability, especially with respect to small and medium enterprises. There are logistic hurdles, high logistic cost, lack of available logistic to the doorstep of the industrial sector. There are very limited number of ports. There is a very high turnaround time. So when you compare the turnaround time, even with that Sri Lanka, India has a very lengthy turnaround time, especially with respect to the marine trade. Apart from the above issues, there are certain issues which have been propping up recently. And this includes that recession has been gripping up the entire global economy after the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. There's a high inflation in US and European countries. War has been engulfing the Eastern Europe, including the Russia and Ukraine. There's a low demand from the African continent. India itself is going around 5 to 7% of economic growth rate, which is not good as compared to what it had a decade ago. Purchasing power in the export destination, let's say US, UK, China, and other countries, is falling. So they are now reducing down their expenditure on what they were importing from India. Let's say India was exporting large number of gold jewelries from its market to the Europe. Now Europeans are not very much fond of these gold jewelries coming from India. So their purchasing power is falling, hence Indian exports are falling. Now this was given by the reports of IMF and World Bank. The next argument is that some of the export-led industries themselves are going through the phase of slowdown. That was actually highlighted by the CMIE report. And lastly, there's a rising deglobalization or protectionism in the Western world. And because of this, bilateral trade is more preferred by these economies. As you can notice easily that in the last 5-6 years, US has been more towards the bilateral trade between India and its own domestic economy with respect to the defense equipments rather than going into the multilateral trade regime. Now, apart from that, there are two important observations that we have taken from the economic survey of this year, which says that the diversification of India's trade is very limited. As you can see, these are the top 10 export destination of India. Highest exports from India are going in the top 3 countries. And in fact, with respect to the trade also, these are the countries in the top 5. So there is lack of diversification for sure. Where are the African nations? Where are the South American nations? India is not able to create exports to those countries. Apart from that, if you go by the skill training, you can easily see that the number of people who are skilled according to the Labor Bureau is one of the least in the trading sector. So when we talk about IT, BPO, financial service, education, the percentage is about 20. On the other hand, in terms of trade, skilling of people or the labor is around 11%, which is very, very low. And this proves that despite having higher export growth, employment generation has not been the priority for India. So what should we do? These are the following 10 important way forwards that you can utilize while writing the answer to these kind of topics. The first is government should start focusing on the labor intensive industries. For this, foreign direct investment in these industries should be promoted. High quality standards in the production should be ensured. High quality means more exports. Skill development of labor in those industries which are export led. Ease of hiring, especially to the MNCs, where global standards could be followed. So, hiring standards, let's say in the SAES area or special economic zone area, where export led industries or services are established, should have the global standards of hiring and firing. There should be promotion to the MSMEs in the export-led industrial clusters. More free trade agreements should be signed to ease out the India's export regime and further promote the employment generation. Government can come up with tax benefits to those which are labor intensive industries. For example, government has launched production linked incentive. Now this is to increase the production of the industrial sector. Government can also come up with labor linked intensive, where those industries which are employing more labor will be incentivized through the tax benefits. Priority sector approach should be taken up, where agricultural exports should become the priority for the government because they have high employment elasticity. And lastly, diversification of exports destination should also be in government's mind. More focus should now shift towards those areas where demand of labor intensive production are high. For example, African nation. So if you talk about handicrafts, you talk about leather industries, textile industries, these products can find better markets in African nation than other countries. So why not explore this kind of export destination diversification? Now before moving to the mains led question, there's an important scheme which was launched by the government. And this fulfills both the criteria of the article. It is known as India International Skills Center Network. This is going to provide skill which is demanded at the global level. So Indian manpower, Indian labor will be provided skill training at the international standards and those skills which are demanded overseas. So Indian labor will be skilled in this sector. They might work outside India or they might work with the same level of standards even inside India. For this, India has signed agreement with Germany, Belarus, UK, France, Australia and many other countries to provide the apprentice and the training sessions. So here is the mains practice question from the discussion that we have recently concluded. Critically examine whether export-led employment generation is a wise idea for Indian economy or not. So you have to stand with one point, yes or no, and you have to substantiate argument on both the sides, taking the final stand. After that, you have to suggest measures, the way forward that we have just discussed, that can enhance the employment in export-led sectors of India. And please remember, labor intensive should be one of the priority point in your answer. With this discussion place, let us now move to the next article for the day. This article of the Hindu newspaper talks about the relations or the bilateral relations between India and Egypt on the pretext that Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is going to be the chief guest for India's upcoming Republic Day celebration this year. And on the sideline of this, many agreements are going to be signed between both these countries. Now, as these agreements have not been signed, so it is not advisable to read about these agreements as of now. That we are going to discuss in the coming DNS. The relevance of this topic is that bilateral relations of India with other nations are important for your General Studies paper 2 in the mains examination. UPSC in the past years have asked the following regions or the countries in this paper. It includes Israel, US thrice, Japan, Africa twice, China, Russia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and even Sri Lanka. On the basis of the same, we are going to look into the different dimension, including the historical, economic, and political, from the perspective of the bilateral relationship between India and Egypt in today's discussion. As we have seen, India and Egypt are now celebrating 75 years of their diplomatic relation. This is far better, far cordial than what India has been sharing with its neighboring countries. Now, the first question is why India needs Egypt. The first foremost reason is that both of them are sharing the non-aligned movement philosophy, where they decided in the decade of 1950s that they are not going to stand up with any of the pole that became the forefront in the international diplomacy with respect to the power projection. In the first decade after the World War II, there were two important geopolitical powers. The first one, the USSR, and the second was US. Both were fighting the Cold War to live up to their hegemony. India, with Egypt and many other countries including Indonesia, has decided to not to join either of the grouping, and they decided to remain non-aligned. Until now, both these countries have been following the same strategy and they have not joined any specific defense grouping like NATO. The second reason is that India's Europe-bound trade passes through the Suez Canal. Now, since the nationalization of Suez Canal after the Second World War, Suez Canal became the most important route for India to reach out to the European markets. And not only that, even the European markets made India to be the most important destination for their high-end exports. And for that matter, India's Europe-bound trade passes through the Suez Canal, which is under the jurisdiction of Egypt. Egypt is the only country that shares a border with Asia, and because of that, Egypt has remained a door for India's reach out to African continent. Now, India is a country which is looking for larger markets for its export, and Africa is the destination which has been going through the higher income rise as far as middle class is concerned. So based on the same, India's outreach for trade relation to Africa can have a catalyst of Egypt. As India is looking into the expansion and the outreach in the Indo-Pacific region, Egypt remains the one of the most important element over there. Through the access of Red Sea, Egypt can provide India the larger access to the western front of Indian Ocean, especially with respect to the maritime security. Now, Egypt is a place which can provide direct access and fight against the sea piracy that is observed in the western front of Indian Ocean. If we look into the Look West policy of India, Egypt frames the most important element in this policy. Egypt not only remains one of the close friends of the Arab world, but also the leader where India can project itself in the good shape. So India's Look West policy cannot be determined without the presence of Egypt. And the last one is the UNSC reform. India is a growing economy as well as a growing geopolitical power. India is looking for a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council, on which the vote of Egypt in the United Nations General Assembly is very, very vital.
Now, keeping these points aside, let us look into why Egypt is important for India. India is a rising economic defense power. India is the third largest GDP in terms of purchasing power parity and the highest spending defense power in the world. Egypt would like to have a more cordial relation with India in order to gain the large markets for its exports, especially in terms of the cotton export, because Egypt is known to export one of the finest and the longest cotton fiber in the world. India is housing one of the largest Muslim population in the world, and as Egypt also has a large Muslim population, the religious context becomes obvious. Both the countries are sharing the non-aligned philosophy and they do not stand with a defense partnership of any grouping. And the last one being that after the Arab Spring, Egypt has shifted towards more open democratic framework, and they have been supporting the democratic philosophies and the principles across the world, and India, being the largest democracy, shares the same value system. As far as area of cooperation is concerned, so recently what we have seen, and that was also mentioned in the article, that Renew Power, an important entity in India, has been deciding to spend around $8 billion to build a clean hydrogen facility in Suez Canal economic zone. And this hydrogen facility will later on be exported to India also. Apart from the green energy, IT sectors, that is Indian IT firms, cybersecurity, small scale and medium scale enterprises, cultural exchanges, solar energy, agriculture and nanotech remains the larger aspect of area of cooperation between these two nations. Now, for the student who are preparing for the UPSC, it is important to understand that all factors and area of cooperation is not shared by each and every country. For that matter, you should be well aware that which of the important strategic sectors are not being shared between India and its member nations. For example, here you can easily deduce that nuclear energy is absent. Here you can easily say that there is almost minimal defense trade. So that point should be kept in mind while writing an answer. Now, coming towards the important dimensions of India-Egypt relationship. The first one we are going to discuss is the economic dimension. India and Egypt have framed a joint trade committee, and now this is a very high level committee which shares the ideas and the pointers to expand the international trade. India and Arab countries have already signed and joined the Energy Forum, which was organized for the first time in 2021, where they have discussed a new framework to bring more energy partnership in the future. As of now, the bilateral trade between both these countries stand at about $4.15 billion, and to your notice, India is sharing a positive or favorable balance of trade where the exports of India to Egypt is far more than India's import from Egypt. The main traded goods between both these countries remains more or less the agriculture and the IT sector, and in agriculture, India is one of the largest exporter of wheat to Egypt, especially after the Ukraine-Russia crisis, and Egypt has been the largest long fiber exporter of cotton to India. And in last, Indian IT firms such as Tata Consultancy Services have been there with the larger presence in cities like Cairo in Egypt. On the political front, both the countries signed the Friendship Treaty under the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru and Abdul Nasir. They have been meeting on the high-level front on the pretext of non-aligned movement. It is a sorry state to say that both the countries and their leaders have not been meeting as far as bilateral status is concerned, and they have been finding the multilateral platform for these kind of meetings. As far as COVID situation is concerned, so Egypt was one country which has been very proactive and very generous to provide remdesivir kind of medicines to India to fight the disease. Egypt has recently signed and rectified the International Solar Alliance, being one of the countries which lies between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, to utilize the solar energy, the initiative that was highlighted and initiated by India and France. India has been providing the grant in aid, and this grant in aid will be including the Pan-Africa telemedicine and the tele-education, and both the front have been utilized by Egypt to a larger extent. As far as defense partnership is concerned, so it includes the India's participation in the Egyptian Defense Expo, a joint defense committee, which is a very high level of initiative to take the defense talk to the next level. And because of this, recently, Cairo have been participating with India on different defense exercises, which includes the Milan, which is a naval exercise, and a Desert Warrior, which is an Air Force based exercise. Cairo, unlike many other Arab nations, I will repeat, unlike many other Arab nations, have been supporting the talks with respect to the Kashmir issue, and it stands with the peaceful resolution to the Kashmir issue between India and Pakistan. And lastly, we come to the cultural aspect. Both the countries shares the world's oldest civilization, the Egyptian civilization and the Indus Valley civilization. Both the countries have a large Islamic population, and that could act as a catalyst for the cultural exchanges. Mahatma Gandhi from Indian Front and Saad Zaglol have been sharing the common view on India's independence through peaceful means. Jawaharlal Nehru and Abdul Nasir had friend relationship, because of which we have the non-aligned movement which came into practice. And lastly, India in the last 7-8 years have been utilizing the yoga diplomacy for the cultural exchanges with the people of Egypt. Now coming to the basic challenges that should always be there while writing the answer. The first challenge is that Egypt and many other Arab nations are anti-Israel. So both these groups had a bitter history of fighting against each other for the small piece of land. And as India had a very good and cordial relations with Israel, India's inroads deeper into the diplomacy of Egypt has remained a challenge. The second one is non-aligned movement as a group itself is losing its shine in the international platform. The reason being simple: the Cold War has ended and USSR has lost its power projection. And since the 1990s, there is a unipolar world dominated by the hegemony of United States. Until the rise of China to go against US, there is going to be a unilateral world. And as there is a unipolar world, non-aligned movement has lost its shine to be the non-sided group. Egypt has housed limited number of Indian diaspora. So unlike Saudi Arabia or the UAE, Egypt does not houses millions of Indians. There are no such workers who are working in these countries, which can be a game changer for India. There are around 3,200 Indians who are as of now in 2022 residing in Egypt. And the last one is there is low bilateral trade. As the economic trade between both these countries is not very vibrant, diplomatic and the political exchanges have remained very, very limited. Now, what should be the ideal way forward? As there are numerous aspects and avenues for the cultural exchanges, including the religion and the yoga diplomacy, that should be intensified. Government of India should look more into the intensification of Look West policy and gradually transfer it to the more strategic Act West policy. India should look into more focus towards the expansion of bilateral trade with special reference to the agricultural goods and the IT sector. And lastly, Government of India could look into the expansion of Indo-Pacific approach to Indo-Abrahamic. Now, this is a keyword that should be kept noted. Now, what is Indo-Abrahamic? Indo-Abrahamic is a new and emerging trans-regional order in which India would like to connect intensively with West Asian nations and the Eastern Mediterranean nation. If India wants to go for the expansion of Act West policy, Indo-Abrahamic should be the main catalytic factor in this area. With this discussion place, let us now move to the next article for the day. This article of the Hindu newspaper talks about a very good governance-led initiative taken up in the state of Kerala. Now, one of the district of Kerala, which is Wayanad, has now become India's first district where all basic government-led documents are available to all the tribal people of that particular district. Now, all this is because of the ABCD program which was launched by the government in that particular district. Now, from the perspective of GS paper 1, tribal related important events can be quoted, and this example could be put up in society section.
In GS paper 2 under the governance heading and with respect to the vulnerable sections in India, this topic can well be utilized. The content for today's discussion would include basics about the ABCD program of Wayanad district, major problems faced by the tribals in India, National Scheduled Tribe Finance and Development Corporation and various schemes run by this important institution, and the constitutional and various legal provisions just for the sake of revisions will be taken up for today. So as far as ABCD program is concerned, so this is Akshay Big Campaign for Document Digitalization Program. It is run by the state of Kerala. The objective is straightforward. All the tribal people will be provided 6 basic government related documents including ration card, Aadhaar, voter ID, birth and the death certificate, health insurance and the bank accounts. And this will be provided to each and every tribal person in the Wayanad district. Under this program, district administration, local administrative bodies, IT mission, tribal development department will participate, and all the concerned department that we have talked about will be available in one camp, and all the documents will be provided simultaneously to a person. Now this is a brilliant initiative and should be quoted by all the students if question related to scheduled caste under the governance is asked. This program can also be utilized as a way forward in those questions where governance related questions are asked in terms of red tapeism, paperwork, hasslement, hierarchy issues and others. Such kind of one-stop solution to all the important documents can well be replicated in other parts of the country, not only for the scheduled tribe but also for all the citizens respectively. Now, when it comes to the macro problems faced by the scheduled tribes in India, the first is socio-economic backwardness. They are not treated equally in the society with the other communities. They have one of the highest ratios of poverty. They are land alienated. If they have forest areas under their control that either be snatched up by the private authorities, companies, or are being misused by the authorities. Because of the lack of documents, they cannot claim their forest and other rights. They are assimilated with the non-tribal population forcefully. Sometimes they are rehabilitated to those places where they cannot sustain their tribal culture. As they belong to the higher poverty sections, they lack health and nutrition facilities. Living in the remotest areas, they are unable to access the best possible health and nutrition services. And the same issue causes the lack of modern facilities in terms of medicines. They are forced to migrate from their local or ancestral properties to the other places because of the external encroachments. Some of the denotified, semi-nomadic and the nomadic tribes are still not included or not enjoying the benefits given to the scheduled tribe under the Indian Constitution. Most of the local customs comes in conflict with the Indian laws, particularly with respect to the child marriages. As far as initiatives with respect to financial inclusion, government has created an institution known by the term National Scheduled Tribe Finance and Development Corporation. The same is available for scheduled caste also. It functions under the Ministry of Tribal Affairs with an objective to provide soft loans for income generating activities. Let's say there's a person belonging to the scheduled tribe and they want to run a small processing unit in their village, let's say for beekeeping. So for that economic generating activity, soft loan will be provided by this organization. These loans are provided with the help of public sector banks, regional rural banks, and along with this even subsidies are provided on various initiatives, for example the interest rate. This organization is running 4 important schemes. The first one is Adivasi Mahila Sashактikaran Yojana, in which loans are provided to the scheduled tribe women. Then there are microcredit schemes for small funds to these people. Market Support Assistance or MSA, in which institutions engaged in the procurement and the marketing of minor forest produce are providing working capital so that they should not run dry of money during the process of their business. And lastly, Adivasi Shiksha Rin Yojana, in which tribal students meet the expenditure for their technical and professional education. So be it marketing, be it business, or be it empowerment including the education, all such kind of loans are being provided by this organization to the tribal people. Now, before winding up, let's revise some of the schemes in constitution and legal parameters available for the empowerment of scheduled tribes in India. Of course, the first is fifth schedule in the constitution, which restricts the transfer of land from the tribal and also regulates its allotment. Here, the role of governor is pioneer. Apart from this, there are other provisions with respect to the reservation of scheduled tribes under various government structures, including the legislations. But when it comes to the land acquisition, because land is the most important aspect of a tribal community, they are too much attached not only for the economic activity but also for the cultural and the emotional well being of the community to a particular land. And for that matter, these are the following legal measures available for them. The second one is Scheduled Tribe and Other Forest Dwellers Act, also known as Forest Rights Act 2006, in which they shall not be evicted or removed from their land until and unless it is recognized and verified. Gram Sabha under this act is made empowered to regulate their own resources and stop any adverse activity. Under another act, which is Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in the Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act 2013, which was also asked by UPSC in the means examination. There will be a body known by National Level Monitoring Committee for Rehabilitation and Resettlement to implement this act. No acquisition is made in the scheduled area without permission. Land acquisition should be taken only as a last resort if all other solutions or methods are exhausted. And in case of acquisition or alteration, Gram Sabha permission is required. So it means decentralization of the decision making. Apart from this, there is PESA Act, which was asked by UPSC in the prelim examination. In this, Gram Sabha or the Panchayat are empowered to make decisions with respect to the acquisition of the land. And lastly, there is ST-SC Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989, in which they are provided legal rights for their land and they are not being discriminated by the other communities with respect to land. With this discussion place, now we have come to end of today's Daily News Simplified. Thanks for watching. Do subscribe this channel for more such videos.